Okay, so as we were talking about before, the forced migration takes a variety of different forms. You have internally displaced persons due to natural disasters. It's about 22 million um, individual internally displaced persons due to conflict and violence is about 33 million people. And then asylum seekers, 1.2 million, and refugees, 16.7 million. So uh, massive displacement overall for individuals. Um, in terms of internally displaced persons, or what in the literature is referred to as IDPs, you can see uh, across the globe fairly dramatic displacement of peoples in uh, particular countries: uh, Iraq, Syria, Somalia, Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Nigeria, as well as Colombia in the Americas. So fairly extensive throughout the globe. In many countries, you see internal displacement by conflict and violence. However, the concentration, we see much of this occurring in areas of rather intense resource extraction and conflict over resources in a given area. And we will actually see this later on in the semester by the third part of the film, All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace. So globally, there are 33 million people that are internally displaced around the world. This is unfortunately a record high number. It is 16% greater than the year prior, which was also a record number. At the end of 2013, sub-Saharan Africa had the largest total number of internally displaced persons at 12.5 million people. The Middle East and North Africa comprised 9.1 million people. 63% of all internally displaced persons globally come from just 5 countries that have been affected by conflict: Syria, Colombia, Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Sudan, as I mentioned previously. 8.2 million people were newly displaced in 2013, and again, unfortunately, this is an increase by 24% compared with 2012. And so you see refugee camps that are established, governments that are struggling potentially with their own populations in order to make ends meet, and then to provide material resources. And there's lots of work and contestation in the context of refugee camps and asylum seekers and how they're actually treated in country, and whether they are treated in the same way as citizens of the country that they have been forced to move into. And when we see internally displaced too, we see here that not necessarily crossing borders, but displaced for other reasons within the country. So going to a different part of the country as a whole. There have been numerous attempts to control borders across time and to limit the flow of people. We talked about this in terms of globalization and unwanted flows. In Anderson, in the 2012 piece called A Game of Risk, Boat Migration and the Business of Bordering Europe, looks at Frontex in Spain and HERA. Overall, these are projects which seek to essentially militarize and secure the border, a very porous border in Spain. And what Anderson notes is that there has actually been, as marginalized and as stigmatized as migration is, this has also led to an entire industry cropping up. And this is what Anderson refers to as the illegality industry, in which careers, networks are made, established, knowledge is generated through discourse, through academic discourse, through the production of knowledge in terms of not only in academic settings, but in knowledge that's disseminated in terms of policy. And then money, massive amounts of money are flowing in for Eurosur and other agencies, intergovernmental agencies within Europe that are focused on understanding or enforcing the border as a whole. And what Anderson, following other anthropologists, maintains is that in order to understand um, migrants, the issue of migration as a whole, we have to understand the situation in which the migrant or migrant illegality is actually produced. And it's produced in large part through what he refers to as this industry, right? Through individuals that focus on keeping others out, on excluding others. So along the Euro-African border, there's been a new national coordination centers which are being integrated into what is known as Eurosur, the European External Border Surveillance System. The interest in Spain occurred in 2005, really ignited in 2005 when sub-Saharan migrants launched what the media in Spain had referred to as a quote-unquote massive assault on the fences surrounding the country's northern Africa enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla. Spain launched an unprecedented naval operation along West African coasts with the EU's European Union's young border agency Frontex. And so in thinking about this from an anthropological perspective, Anderson draws from Beck and Beck's notion of this idea of security and risk in particular. And Beck defines risk as the anticipation of a catastrophe, something that will potentially be catastrophic. And then what is done in order to prevent that catastrophe from happening, and in the name of preventing that from happening. And so we can think back to earlier in the semester when we were talking about the humanitarian movement around the idea of population control, that individuals should today curb population growth at the country level. So the country would be responsible for managing this in its citizens as a whole to prevent the future catastrophe that would occur in an Ehrlich sense, in a Malthusian sense of population overshoot. And so what this anticipation of catastrophe, this idea of risk, has really developed into is a militarized policing of immigration as a whole. And the humanitarian turns within the discourse are quite apparent in Anderson's work. He talks to a number of representatives that have worked with HERA, that have worked with Frontex. You can see some anti-Frontex graffiti outside the agency's headquarters there in the figure. They talk about the idea of the priority is to save human lives. So this policing of the border becomes essentially a humanitarian intervention, and it entails intercepting all the boats that try to arrive in Spain before they reach the coast. So this notion of humanitarianism enables a migration of sovereignty away from the European shores by dissolving the patchwork of maritime boundaries. So there are around every sovereign nation, there are essentially buffer zones that go out into the ocean in terms of economic exclusion, in terms of policing types of activities, and then you have the law of the sea coming into play. But what this does is this, in a humanitarian frame, it gets around these legal issues so that control of migration becomes a humanitarian effort rather than a policing effort on the open seas. Anderson continues and notes that such sea surveillance depends on framing boat migration inherently as a risk to life. And so anyone who's on a migrant, who's on a boat, is necessarily in danger in the ocean. And so the policing efforts become humanitarian efforts to save these individuals from the potential risk of death on the open ocean. So migrants had to be prevented from leaving their country of origin for their own good, and prevented from going further out into sea for their own good. So this idea of risk bridges humanitarianism and crime fighting. The idea of the enunciation or the discourse that is around policing and militarization of borders, and then how that actually gets put into effect. And so this goes to this notion of politics, the politics behind it, this idea of an invasion occurring, idea of risk, and the idea of security as a whole, and then the patrols that actually occur. So there is an underlying ideology, knowledge network that supports this actual physical policing in a militarized sense here. And all of this language together, this notion of risk, this notion of humanitarianism, and how crime fighting is just something that happens there. The primary focus again is on this notion of humanitarianism. It provides the deep politicized language that is needed in order to make migrant boats an abstract threat to the external border as a whole. Anderson concludes noting that as if by a conjuring trick, a migrant boat has become a source of risk sold on to industrial investors. And this has to do with the illegality industry as a whole, the fact that there is a large amount of money that's being dedicated by the state, by the EU, by other international agencies and groups, and how a lot of this goes into the privatization of security as a whole and the public-private relationships that occur overall in policing. And this, of course, is not only isolated in the context of Spain and Frontex and Eurosur, but is a broader phenomenon that is occurring worldwide. In this lecture, then, I have hoped to convey some key concepts and ideas in migration and hopefully provide food for thought on questions about why individuals move, whether this is a choice of agency, how much agency is actually exerted, how much of this is voluntary, how much of this is structural, how much of this is forced in terms of actual physical force or natural disasters which erode the economic and environmental base of activities that make life possible, a normal life possible. And then what should or could be done in order to either encourage or prevent migration, and how this changes over time depending on the country's, the state's own interest in providing for residents or economic productivity as a whole. And then who should act and at what level in terms of migration globally. And I think we see this particularly in Anderson's article, at least in terms of the justification for action and how the state has essentially made claims about humanitarianism of citizens that are essentially non-citizens, migrants that are coming, attempting to make crossings, and these illegal crossings, and how these are, in fact, potentially detrimental to the overall psyche of the migrants themselves, how they're treated, how they're received in their home in the countries that they're coming into, as well as in some instances, as we saw in Kane's article, with remittances and flows in terms of sometimes comprising vast amounts of the gross domestic product, how these migrants are, on the one hand, perceived in a very negative light, and another, in their home countries, in a very positive light. I hope to have shown that we have talked about migration quite a bit throughout this semester, and indeed many of the ideas that we've talked about, the key global problems, are in fact interrelated with one another. Human migration is a historical impact. We're seeing continued migration from rural to urban areas and increasing urbanization overall. The flow of remittances from that globally and their importance, and then the continuing issue, of course, of policing borders.